Today we're going to Shanghai, one of my favourite cities. The stars that hang high over Shanghai bring back the memory of a thrill. I've been looking high and I've been looking low, looking for my Shanghai Lil. I learned to love her, the little devil was just a butterfly. But you'll discover something on the level shining in her eye. I've been trying to forget her, but what's the use, I never will. I'll be looking high and I'll be looking low till I find my Shanghai Lil. Between the First and Second World Wars, Shanghai was considered the raciest city on earth. And it's not surprising when you think about it, the way it was built. It was the largest city at the time in Asia. And do you know of another city that, when you think about places like Hyde Park in central London or in New York, Central Park, but what sort of park did Shanghai have in its centre? It had a race course where huge amounts of money were made and lost. And in fact, when you think of the people who lived there, they were a racy bunch themselves. Even Madame Mao, who became the second wife of Mao Zedong, who led communist China and eventually led to China's the demise of Shanghai as its major city. Even Madame Mao came from Shanghai, and she'd been a minor a film star in the Shanghai films. And when she was in power in Shanghai, she made sure that her rival women movie stars were bumped off or jumped out of windows of their apartments to their death in Shanghai. I learned to love her, the little devil was just a butterfly. But you'll discover something on the level shining in her eye. Oh, I've been trying to forget her, but what's the use, I never will. I'll be looking low and I'll be looking high till I find my Shanghai Lil. Shanghai started out as a fishing town. Shanghai just means on the sea in Chinese. But there were famous places like the Zigzag Bridge that were built back in the 18th century. The British arrived in the 1840s when Shanghai was ceded to them as one of the treaty ports along with Hong Kong and other places because of out of the Opium Wars, and it became Britain's most successful of the treaty ports. In fact, its richest and most successful colonial outpost of all of the British Empire, because it was a license to print money there. It was in the middle of China's east coast. It had direct access at the mouth of the Yangtze River to the whole of the interior of China, and it would be impossible for a Brit or other European to lose money there. And in fact, the British arranged for concessions to be given, and this is how Shanghai developed into this huge city. There's the British concession, which is carved out by the river, And then there was the American concession next to it. The British and the Americans then joined together after about 20 years and called it the International Concession Settlement. There's the French one, which is the most stylish, and you still have the boulevards with the trees in it and things. And then there was the Japanese one. But the real power was exercised in a place called the Bund, which is photographed here on the front cover of the book, and the back, which I photographed, and this huge array of powerhouses, power places where the big money was made. First of all, from peddling opium into China, and then from other forms of export from China, import and export. Headquarters of the HSBC, Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, a huge lush building. One end of the Bund was the Shanghai Club, where things were decided privately over a drink or two, and the other end was the British Consulate building, where it was put on paper and made law. And between was the ways all these companies, big companies from Britain and America and France, where they made money hand over fist. But it was a sort of place that was, as I said, a racy place, that outside this sort of big pompous frontage was all sorts of things going on. One of them was the corruption, which carried on even when the British stopped themselves trading in opium and became respectable with banks like HSBC and so on. And there were places that did carry on, mostly run by Chinese, often with European backing or vice versa. And the British didn't mind because for two reasons. One is they pushed it out of the international settlement where people spoke English, where the Americans and British were, and so it's operated out of the French settlement, and so they could complain to the French about it but not actually do anything about it. The reason they didn't do anything about it is because these opium dealers in the 20s and 30s were funding the Chinese nationalists who were holding the government of China together in Nanjing, but actually doing the British and Americans' bidding. And they supplied all the money to keep the thing going in their fight against the communist insurgents. But the British themselves were responsible for being asleep at the switch on the communist insurgents who they wanted to keep out, because in the early 1920s, at a police station, a British police station in the middle of Shanghai, they shot into the crowd and killed a lot of student demonstrators, communist student demonstrators, from the University of Shanghai. You can imagine that gave the new Communist Party of China, which had just been set up in Shanghai, a cause célèbre. And this is the place that I found where all this took place. Here, it's an extraordinary picture, and you can see here that on the left in white are the British bosses wearing their pith helmets, and then under them are the Sikh police with their turbans and things, and then under them are the Chinese police. There's a whole sort of pecking order you see there. This was taken just after this shooting incident took place, which gave it the cause célèbre it needed. And here is the same spot now, which is just a huge commercial area. Young people walking past with no reference to it at all, but not far away is a huge sculpture, massive sculpture, which celebrates or marks that shooting, which gave life to the Communist Party of China and would lead to the takeover eventually of China by Mao Zedong. Well, when war came, the Japanese soon invaded, and the British fired a sort of a little shot from a frigate, and then ran at the white flag. They knew they couldn't defend the place. In fact, they had withdrawn troops, and the Chinese were treated appallingly by the Japanese there in Singapore throughout the war. But one of the things on the better side of things that did happen was that the Shanghai, along with parts of Spain, was the only place in the world that would that had welcomed, before the Japanese came, refugees, Jewish refugees from Europe, and there was a big Jewish contingent of Germans and others, Russians and others, in Shanghai. And in fact, they contributed enormously, and they managed to live throughout the war and survive. They left, of course, after the war, but they did survive. And one of the reasons was that the Japanese couldn't understand why the Germans were killing, murdering the Jews in Europe, because to them they just looked like Europeans. They thought, well, you know, which the argument could see, well, why are you murdering the Chinese yourself, which the Japanese were? But we won't go there. But one of the things that the Jewish contingent had brought to Shanghai was a great sense of style, and most of the buildings and the entertainment side of things, particularly in cinemas and in the theatres and in the cinemas and dance halls, were set up as Jewish enterprises. And one of the things they did do was to commission the latest architecture. So you see some very quintessential architecture of the early 20th century preserved throughout Shanghai. And in fact, it's the best in the world for the preservation of Art Deco, such as the Cathay Cinema and other buildings, and the Park Hotel and so on. These beautiful big Art Deco buildings that have been preserved. And one of the reasons they weren't knocked down by the communists when they took over in 1949 is that they neglected Shanghai deliberately, because to them it was a stain on their reputation on China, because this was a sort of living proof of how capitalism had bullied China, and they wanted to concentrate all their efforts on building Beijing. So it meant that the Art Deco was escaped, and that's why it's there today and in all its glory. Much of it had been boarded up during the communist era after 1949. This and also it's because in Shanghai the people who made the money, who were running Shanghai, disappeared to Hong Kong in 1949. So they left this sort of edifices behind, and nothing happened to them. And it is a wonderful feeling to be able to see this place, but there's also a sort of sadness to it in a way. There's something evocative about Shanghai in the way that it's so lovely preserve the past, first just by default because nobody took any notice, but today, of course, as I show in my photographs, it actually preserved the past actively now by restoring the Bund. The Bund has been completely restored, for example. It is absolutely magnificent. And you may remember in the war, that film about the war, that more which was written based on a book written by J.G. Ballard, called Empire of the Sun, and it was made by Steven Spielberg. And they had this very this Welsh lullaby, which I always thought of when I was looking at some of these buildings from the past that stood there in a sort of like as though they were in a time warp. One of the images that sums up Shanghai for me, it's not the best one, but I think it does, the modern Shanghai, is this: the British Public Gardens with the bandstand here, photographed long ago. And it was there, of course, where they say, well, no dogs or Chinese allowed, but it didn't actually say that, but that was a sentiment, because the only Chinese allowed in were the ayahs or the nannies of white people who could sit and listen to the band playing in the gardens there. And what a contrast from the same place now, where you've got this huge edifice here and people now exercise in front of it every morning. This huge thing which commemorates the martyrs, the communist martyrs who relieved Shanghai of the Westerners. And there it is. It's supposed to be based on 3 rifles leaning against one another in the same place as that one stood. Shanghai today is one of the largest cities on earth, and this vibrancy, as I say, they had this sort of sad background. But on the other hand, if a Martian came to me or to you and said, oh, look, I've only got a little bit of time, could you explain to me what the 20th century was about, and maybe the early 21st century, but I've only got time to go to one place, where would you go? Where would you take them? Well, I suppose one of the places you'd first consider would be Berlin. But with some thought about it, and since the developments that have happened to Shanghai in the last 30 years, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a better place to explain the 20th century and the early 21st century than Shanghai. And actually, if I had to live in Asia, I don't know, it would probably actually be Shanghai that I would choose, and probably in the former French concession of Shanghai, because it is rather beautiful there. And then here is a panorama of Shanghai then and now. In fact, it's almost as though you've got a then and now in one shot. But here's Shanghai. This shows how quickly it is developed. This was taken only in 1987, this photograph of the Bund in front of us and Pudong opposite. And now look at it. And the biggest cities on earth are sort of then and now in one, with the then in the foreground and the now in the background. I did say in the book that I described Shanghai. I said, well, it's a sort of it's the New York City of China. But the question remains, given the rise of China, not just Shanghai, how long will it be before New York City is regarded and spoke about as America's Shanghai? I learned to love her, the little devil was just a butterfly. But you'll discover something on the level shining in your eye. Oh, I've been trying to forget her, but what's the use, I never will. I'll be looking high and I'll be looking low till I find my Shanghai Lil.